Well, thanks so much to everyone for being here. We talk about many complicated statistical ideas in this book. A simple one is the idea of home field advantage, and that's what I think I have right now. This is obviously my home bookstore, 5 blocks from my house, and it's certainly a hometown crowd. It's so nice to look out over the audience and see so many people who are special to me and have helped this book along. One of you is actually already up past your bedtime, so thanks to my dad for pushing through on that. Really, though, there's so many faces from Crown, my publisher, including my editor, Kevin Doughton, who didn't blink when I said we had to write this book, or we decided we had to write this book in about 3.5 months after they somehow made good on this prediction. And here it is. So thank you, Kevin, and everyone else at Crown. Chris Paris-Lamb, my agent. Sorry, this is starting to sound like the Oscars, but thanks to Chris Paris-Lamb, my agent. Everybody at Sports Illustrated, so many faces who I've worked with for almost 14 years in many cases, are here, including Chris Stone next to me. People who have read the book will be interested to know that Sig Mejdal is in the audience, one of the lead characters who is toting around a very large ring in his pocket. I'm sure he'd give you a look at that if you're interested in it. And of course, in the front row here, my family, who's been most supportive of all, including my wife Alice and daughter Madeline. So yeah, what we're going to do tonight, it should be pretty relaxed, maybe about 45 minutes. I think I'm going to read a little bit from the book, and then Chris Stone, who's the editorial director of Sports Illustrated, will ask me some undoubtedly difficult questions, and then we'll open up to you guys who've been so nice to come out tonight. So the setup for what I'm going to read is I've gone down to Houston to see what's going on with what was then the worst baseball team in 50 years. I've started to get the idea that they're up to something unusual, that they have a new technique to build a team that goes beyond what Billy Beane was doing in Moneyball, in that it not only takes advantage of every statistical technique and every bit of data available to them, but it brings back in the human factor, scouts, things that have been overlooked perhaps by many for the past 15 years, really, or 13 years at that point. And they have a really new idea about how to build a winner. So I've come back to New York. I've filed my story to Chris Stone here, and that's where we pick up. Chris Stone became the 9th managing editor of Sports Illustrated 20 years after he had gone to work for the magazine as a hockey reporter. Publishing was in his blood. His father was the longtime deputy editorial page editor of one of the country's last independent newspapers, Connecticut's The Day. From the moment Stone, fresh out of Columbia School of Journalism, joined SI, he hoped to one day run it, which would mean, among other things, that he would help set the agenda for each week's national sports discussion. In 2012, he got there. 2 years later, near the end of June of 2014, Stone faced a problem that for many other magazine editors represented a regular headache. The issue's close was approaching, and he did not have a cover. Stone hadn't expected it to be that kind of week. Early summer was a fertile period on the sports calendar, bringing with it the Stanley Cup Finals, the NBA Finals, and in 2014, the World Cup. That year, though, the best-of-7 series that decided the hockey and basketball champions had ended early. The Los Angeles Kings needed only 5 games to beat the New York Rangers on June 13th, and the San Antonio Spurs required the same number of contests to put away the Miami Heat on June 15th. Both of those championships happened too quickly to be honored on an SI cover that would close on June 23rd and officially be dated June 30th. The U.S. men's soccer team seemed a strong cover contender until the final seconds of stoppage time in its World Cup group stage game against Portugal on June 22nd. Then Cristiano Ronaldo curled a cross into the box in Brazil, which a diving Silvestre Varela headed past U.S. goalkeeper Tim Howard to turn what had promised to be a stunning American win into a draw. The cover of Sports Illustrated didn't memorialize ties. A fourth possibility emerged that same Sunday. The American golfer Michelle Wie, a 6-foot-tall former phenom who turned pro a week before her 16th birthday in 2005, had, after years of promise, finally broken through to win her first major, the U.S. Women's Open. Alan Shipnuck, SI's senior golf writer, was on the scene at North Carolina's Pinehurst No. 2 and pulled an all-nighter to produce a sensitively observed 3,000 words about how we, into whom he'd invested a decade of reporting, had overcome the pressures of having been a failed child prodigy to achieve her long-awaited victory. He filed in the certain expectation that it would make the cover, a rarity for a golf story that was not about Tiger Woods. Stone, though, had begun to consider a fifth option. He genuinely bought into the Astros' potential as I described it in the piece I submitted. I came away from the story convinced that the Astros had a really interesting plan, he said, and I believed in it. The Monday the issue was to close, June 23, 2014, Stone asked me a question. By when, realistically, would this thing work? That is, by when would the nucleus of players the Astros had in place be old enough to become stars? And by when would the front office have had enough time to make enough decisions to put the winning product it envisioned on the field? Was it 2020? 2019? 2017, I told him. A few days later, Shipnuck walked the 50 yards from his house to his mailbox in Carmel, California, with a smile on his face. He opened the mailbox's rusty door and fished around until he felt SI's smooth pages. He couldn't wait to see the photograph of a triumphant we that Stone had selected. He looked down, and his mouth fell open. Imagine my utter shock and despair to find that waiting for me instead was the garish uniform of the crappiest team in baseball, Shipnuck recounted. Was this a prank being pulled by my mailman? Sadly, no. The cover photo wasn't of Michelle Wie. It was of George Springer, the Astros rookie outfielder. Not only had Stone chosen to honor the worst professional club there was, one that didn't even seem to be trying to win, instead of a newly minted champion, but he blessed it with an absurd prediction about its future success. Your 2017 World Series champs, read the cover line, printed in capital letters to the right of the swinging Springer. It was the longest of shots. During spring training, Vegas usually assigns a given year's favorite less than a 20% chance of actually winning that fall's title. Sports Illustrated's baseball preview issue, in fact, hadn't accurately predicted a season's champion in a decade and a half, since the Yankees in 1999, and Derek Jeter's defending champions were no dark horse. The magazine still got letters about a cover from 1987 headlined, regrettably for several reasons, Indian Uprising, on which it anointed Cleveland's club the American League's best 6 months before it finished 61 and 101. Now SI was telling 3 million subscribers that baseball's worst team in half a century was just 3.5 years away from winning the World Series. Stone had just joined Twitter, and soon he had his first troll. It is exceedingly unusual for any staffer at any publication to publicly question a top editor for a cover choice, but Alan Shipnuck was so incensed that he couldn't help himself. He pulled out his phone and tweeted, "My @the Michelle Wie feature is in this week's SI. The one with the last place Astros on the cover. Hashtag kill me now. Hashtag please." Stone accepted Shipnuck's insolence with good humor. His was just one voice in the chorus of disbelief and rage that greeted the Astros cover, rising even from the club's hometown, especially there, actually. It was more of an attention-grabbing, perhaps even tongue-in-cheek projection than a prediction, sniffed the Houston Chronicle. "Thank you for the laugh," tweeted one representative fan. "I haven't had a healthy laugh like that in a long time. 2017 champs. Bah ha 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 ha." You know how this turns out. On November 1st, 2017, the Houston Astros won the World Series. George Springer was named the series' most valuable player. It was a result that thrilled almost everyone in sports, especially Astros fans and gamblers, who saddled Las Vegas sports books with a record $11.4 million loss on baseball that month, many of their bets inspired by what had once appeared a preposterous prediction. There was at least one notable exception. Earmuffs, Madeline. "Bite me, Reiter," wrote Alan Shipnuck. The Houston Astros were one of the worst teams in baseball history and decided to become one of the best. And Astroball is about how they did it.
next week's cover is 2021, the year Reiter and Stone finally stopped milking this 2014 Astros cover.
You have to go a little further out than that.
Yeah, we actually will never stop milking it. But I will say, Ben's too modest to say this, but it's absolutely true. I mean, really, there were 4 cover choices that I threw in Grant Wall because we were in the middle of a contract negotiation, and he said, "Hey, weren't you considering the Portugal cover that week?" And I said, "Yes." Okay. Strictly to advance our negotiation. But it was either the we cover or it was the Astros. And you don't often, a lot of weeks you're just at the mercy. If the NBA Finals had been going on or Stanley Cup Finals had been going on, we would have had to put one of those 2 things on the cover in all likelihood. But some weeks you have a week when you don't have something, it's a great opportunity. And maybe you get a story that comes in that is so good that the quality of the story, you will find a way to get it on the cover. And I can say that with absolute certainty. I mean, there was nothing that argued for the Astros being on the cover that week, except that you produced an exceptional story.
Go on.
Yes. The other thing was we put George Springer on the cover, and it's funny that Alan references the garishly covered uniforms. It was the garishly covered uniform that got George Springer onto that cover because, and I say this with, in complete honesty, I had no idea who George Springer was when we put him on the cover that week. I mean, he was a rookie in the midst of a decent but not spectacular rookie campaign. I believe he finished 8th in the Rookie of the Year, but it was just such a beautiful image in those beautifully, hideously orange uniforms. And really, that's the story. But it all comes from a place of an exceptional story. So anyways, we're going to divide this into 4 blocks, and we're going to change the format a little bit here. I'm going to ask a few questions that Ben can expand on at some length. Then we'll do a quick lightning round of quick questions that Ben can answer in 1 word or 2. And then we'll open up to 2 or 3 questions from the crowd, so as not to push your questions to the end. And chances are your questions are going to be better than my questions. But to get started, today I was reading a story that will appear in this week's magazine. It's on the Seattle Mariners. And the second paragraph of the story opened, "In the Moneyball era." And I just thought to myself, perhaps by executive fiat, at some point, when are we going to change that to, it seems a little outdated, shouldn't we be saying in the Astroball era? And that's a good lead into the first question, because obviously you didn't shy away from the idea of people identifying Astroball with Moneyball. Just look at the title of the book. And we know there's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences between the two. Can you talk a little bit about the similarities and differences of Moneyball and Astroball?
Sure. Well, Moneyball came out in 2003, and I think it's not a stretch to say that there would be no Astroball without Moneyball. Moneyball is really what turned a lot of the owners in the game onto the idea that there was this whole world of advantage they could be capturing that they weren't. You know, the analysis of data to enhance kind of their traditional operations like scouting. People like Jeff Luno, who was a consultant at McKinsey beforehand and ran tech companies, and Sig Mejdal, who worked at NASA and Lockheed Martin, would likely have never had the opportunity to even come into baseball without Moneyball. So Moneyball was really about the primacy of data and statistics over human observation, right? Like, the idea is that human observation had its uses, but now we have a better way. We don't need to rely on fallible human beings with their biases and all of that anymore, when the numbers can tell us all we need to know. Astroball is not about one or the other. It's about merging both. You know, I think the Astros' real stroke of genius was realizing that in human perception, in human gut instinct, there is value that is not captured by performance data in particular. Human scouts with their experiences can sense qualities in players that could give them advantage that perhaps their numbers don't describe. So what they did was they found a way to kind of strip out the good stuff from those scouting evaluations. What is the productive bias and what's actually real, and what has value, and then figure out a way to synthesize it with all that performance data to get the best out of both man and machine at the same time. I think in a lot of industries, actually, the data landscape has flattened now, Chris. Everybody has the same numbers. Everybody has, math geniuses who know how to analyze it and pull out, conclusions from it. So I think we're seeing increasingly the advantage is in that those soft sources of data, things like chemistry, things that numbers can't necessarily quantify, in baseball and, in banking and in all sorts of things. So I think that's the Astroball approach. Not saying that data is better than human observation, saying that all sources of predictive information matter, and it's a matter of figuring out how to combine them and get the best out of them.
Going back to the story, when you went down to Houston, you wrote the original story. One thing that really struck me was, the narrative typically around these stories is, this is a little bit of a caricature, but not much of one, is Ivy League educated analysts choking on the cigar smoke of pot-bellied scouts. But what really, take us into that room when you went and visited the Astros before their 2014 draft and what you saw. Because one of the things that really struck me from that story and still strikes me is that it was a team of people coming from different places, but there was a lot more harmony, a lot more collaboration. It was the nerd cave collaborating and joking with Nolan Ryan, who's about as emblematic of quote-unquote old school baseball as anyone. What is it that you saw in your several days down there ahead of the draft that struck you perhaps as being a little different from the narrative that a lot of us have become accustomed to?
Right. Well, I'd been around, struggling organizations before, and this one didn't feel anything like those. Like perhaps the Mets of the mid-2000s, or
We'll be coming to that.
Okay. This didn't seem to be anything like them. They had a plan, and there was a certain harmony in the room that seemed like everybody had bought in. Now, that wasn't always the case for Jeff Luhnow or Sig when they started in St. Louis. When they got there, they were getting to the second most successful baseball organization in history behind the Yankees. And yet the owner had said, I read this book, I think there's this new way to go about things to at least complement our traditional operations. We're going to bring in these guys who understand data and how we could exploit it and integrate them into our operations. The Cardinal Scouts, by and large, did not like this, right? I mean, at one point when one of the executives who persistently showed that he was going to freeze Jeff Luhnow out in particular, he wasn't going to help him, was going to talk to him, was about to be fired by the owner had Luhnow go into work off-site that day in case the guy tried to come after him and fight him. So cultural change like that is very difficult, at least at first. In Houston, the fact was that Jeff Luhnow was the boss, right? So it was either, he had handpicked everybody who was in that room, people who were going to buy into what he was doing and who he thought had the talent to contribute to it. But that didn't mean that he got rid of all the old timers. That didn't mean he got rid of all the experienced scouts. In fact, there's one named Ralph Bratton who I remember. He's a scout for 25 years with the Astros, big, bushy walrus mustache Texan, and he would kind of be like, he's like, Jeff's not trying to make us do anything new. He's just using what we do in a different way. So that's really, that's the type of harmony that I sensed in that draft room as I sat watching this organization debate who they're going to pick number one overall in the 2014 draft. And look, when you were in that room, yes, Sig were there, the analysts were there, they were contributing, but most of the talking was done by the scouts, by Nolan Ryan, who would chime in with his thoughts on players. And you knew that every bit of information everybody was providing was, being listened to and probably being incorporated into their predictive models.
To be clear, the Astros weren't the first analytics era front office to understand that there's a human element here, to understand that human variables had to be appreciated and leveraged as well. So, what comes to mind, I think the Red Sox did a very good job of that after Theo took over. So what is it that makes what the Astros did different than what the Red Sox did or the Cubs did or the Rangers did?
I think it was, first of all, the level of commitment to this plan. it was very painful for everybody, not just in the front office, but anybody who cheered for the Astros, right, to live through what the implementation of this plan meant. I mean, the worst team over a 3-year span in 50 years. Like, that was an ugly way to be. And when you're out in public every day, when you're going to the games every night, it really takes a level of confidence in what you're doing that probably most of these teams don't have. And most of these teams didn't really have to display because they weren't starting from the bottom as the Astros were. So I think that really it was the commitment that it took to see this thing through and the level to which they had it guide their decisions to the point where they weren't making one decision really that their plan didn't suggest was wise. I think that's probably what separates them from these other teams who started to get an idea that you might be able to use both of them, but didn't go into it as fully as Houston did.
All right, lightning round.
Ooh.
3 questions. Number 1, true or false? Dallas Keuchel has reached out to me insisting that you, Ben Reiter, receive a raise for the World Series prediction.
He said he's going to do that. Did he do it?
False, he didn't. Big words.
That's disappointing.
Question 2. Carlos Beltran would make the ideal manager for the blanks.
I mean, I think we need to give Mickey Callaway a little more time. But if Mets fans have forgiven him for, looking at strike 3, I think that he might be a good choice.
Question 3. True or false? Joe Buck has learned the correct pronunciation of your name.
Definitely false. It's reader for life with Joe.
So anyways, let's take a couple of questions, 2 questions from the crowd, and I'll let Ben, you pick out whomever you like here.
Charlie.
Congratulations, gentlemen. Thank you. Wouldn't it make sense for MLB to fold both Florida franchises, open 4 franchises in San Juan, the Dominican, Mexico City, and Havana, have 4 18 leagues with 4 division winners and 4 best record wild cards, extend the season 2 weeks on 162 games to play all the beginning games in the Southern Hemisphere, right? And does the Latin American baseball team have, and I assume the Japanese do based on nothing, have the same obsession with these ridiculous statistics?
I think there's merit to the idea for sure. I think you should write a letter to Rob Manfred. I'm not sure that he's viewed it in quite as holistic a way as you just presented it. And no, I don't think that the Latin American leagues have embraced statistics in this way. And I think that that's one reason why, players coming from Latin American countries often have, styles of play or qualities that, are some of these unquantifiable things like that kind of give them an advantage that perhaps even the traditional Moneyball types of team can't quite measure. Dan.
And the use of rational analysis in something like scouting is only as useful as the decision-making algorithm that combines it with whatever objective analysis you have. So you can't just wake up one morning, as Jim Simon, the mathematician, would say, I trust the analysis today, but next morning I don't really trust it as much for some reason. So was it really somebody at the top like Jeff Luno making subjective decisions about how to combine those things, or do you feel like they had an algorithm to do that?
I think they largely had an algorithm for most decisions. I think, and that's what the book is about, kind of how they use that to combine all sorts of predictive information to make decisions that really were shocking to even other teams like the Red Sox, like drafting Carlos Correa #1 overall in 2013. Nobody saw that coming. Clearly that was a decision that worked out. But I also think there were certain points along the way that, Jeff Luno and other people in the front office had developed their own gut instinct to go against the advice of their algorithms. For example, trading for Justin Verlander, as I write in Chapter 8, with 2 seconds to go before the deadline last August, results were mixed. Some of the Astros algorithms suggested that it's not wise to acquire a 35-year-old pitcher who makes $20 million a year and sacrifice 3 top prospects for him. But there were other factors that went into it that Luna was considering. The fact that the city had just gone through a hurricane and could use a boost was one of them. I'm not sure how high it was. And just the fact that the clubhouse was falling apart a little bit. Dallas Keuchel was publicly criticizing the front office for not having made a trade to that point. They were playing terribly. So I think he developed a gut instinct of his own that really, tipped the decision in the direction of trading for Verlander. And of course, we all saw what the result of that was. Madeline Reiter.
Madeline had a question about why her name was in the book twice.
Madeline's question is, why is her name in the book twice? It's a very good question. And Celia and Mommy. The first is a dedication to Alice, Madeline, and Celia, the best team there is. So that's something that we write in the front of the book, where we honor people who are important to us. And the second was the acknowledgments, where I thank you and your sister and your mom for being so patient with me as I kind of disappeared for 3.5 months this winter to try to write this. So that's why.
All right, we'll move on to the next block of questions, and we'll talk a little bit about other parts of the book.
Great.
That, if you can believe it, are even better than the preface that Ben just read. I want to talk a little bit about 2 of my favorite chapters in the book. The first has to do with Carlos Beltran. And all I'm going to say here is the name Ricky Pitts, and I want you to take it from there.
So the Carlos Beltran chapter is about the idea of team chemistry, which is one of those things that, even the most advanced statistics still don't capture, right? Like, it used to be that a lot of sabermetricians didn't even believe that it really had an impact on winning or losing. This idea, like, if the team got along or not, you couldn't capture numbers, so who even knows if it's real? Now, actually, a data analyst for an NBA team yesterday emailed me and was very interested in that chapter, because he said that, among a lot of statisticians and data people, the idea of chemistry is the holy grail. Why do some teams get along, other teams don't? And are there measurable outcomes to this? So that's the chapter that focuses on Carlos Beltran. Ricky Pitts was a player who befriended Carlos Beltran when Beltran was in the minor leagues. He was struggling. He felt very alone. He came from Puerto Rico and didn't speak any English. He really felt like an outcast, and he wasn't playing very well either. Ricky Pitts was not the prospect that Beltran was, but he came up to him and he started speaking Spanish to him and kind of brought him into the fold. And to this day, if you go into a lot of clubhouses in the major leagues and any level of baseball, there's a distinct divide, almost like right down the middle of this room in the clubhouse. On one side are the Spanish-speaking players. On the other side are the English-speaking players. It's not like they don't like each other. They just don't really spend that much time together. And I spoke to a bunch of academics who study organizational psychology and things, and they say when you have what they call fault lines like that, that can really hinder the performance of any group, because it, creates rival factions, it hinders the exchange of useful information, all sorts of things that are hard to measure but are real. So Carlos Beltran, as he aged and was 40 years old last year, one of his priorities of many was to bond the clubhouse, to get the Spanish speakers and the English speakers together on the same side. And that's what he did. And when you walk into the Astros clubhouse, it's not like most others. It's a real sense of togetherness. And I think that that's lasted, even though Carlos Beltran has now retired. Now, as a player, I don't know if they would have paid him $16 million, because he kind of didn't have a great season last year. I don't know if you pay $16 million to somebody who does that, but there was certainly very immeasurable element to what he did for the Astros last year.
But in the minds of some of the players, very measurable things. I mean, Carlos Correa suggested, that 7 of his home runs?
Yeah, Carlos Correa, he was estimating, of course, but he said that he thought that 7 of the 24 home runs he hit last year was directly from Carlos Beltran sitting down with him, teaching him how to read pitchers and game plan to a degree that he'd never attempted before. Obviously, these are rough numbers. I know a lot of the data-minded people in the room are probably cringing right now, but I think there's some truth to them as well.
Well, the Beltran chapter, of course, was the chapter that we excerpted in Sports Illustrated, and it was either going to be that chapter or the chapter that we'll talk about in a second on J.D. Martinez. And I can tell you the reason we elected to go with the Beltran chapter over the Martinez chapter is, frankly, and this still won't sound very journalistic, is we want to help our friend and colleague sell books. And we just thought by going with Beltran, it felt a little bit more emblematic of what a happy story the Astros were in 2017. Whereas Martinez, to me, it's fascinating. Ben's going to talk about it in a second. The Martinez chapter was about one of their greatest and most documented failures. And I think, people coming away from that say, oh, God, is this whole book going to be about, how the Astros screwed up in the same year that they won a World Series? But, with respect to Martinez, success is never a collection of neat incremental decisions, especially in baseball. So how did the Astros whiff on Martinez, and what did they learn from it?
Right. Well, this is probably their biggest mistake. One of the things that impressed me when I met them in 2014 was that they never said that they expected that their plan would lead to correct decisions every time. They were looking for a marginal advantage in correct decisions over their competitors. Well, J.D. Martinez was one where they certainly made the wrong decision. J.D. Martinez in spring training of 2014 was an outfielder who'd been in the big leagues a couple of years. He hadn't had a lot of success. He's a below average outfielder, and the team was getting younger at the time. They were thinking that they'd probably get rid of him. And he knew this. So he went down to Venezuela and he kind of retooled his swing over the winter. He completely overhauled it. And he came back in spring training. And he sat down with Jeff Luhnow and the manager at the time, Bo Porter. And he said, I really think I figured something out here, guys. I went down to Venezuela. The ball just feels really different coming off of my bat. All I ask is that you give me a chance during spring training to show you what I did. According to him, they said that they would do that. And then they didn't. They gave him only 18 at-bats. And then they cut him at the end of spring training because they thought that a guy who was already 27, all statistics said a guy who was already 27 who hadn't had a lot of success probably wouldn't get better no matter what he said. But a couple days later, he signed with the Detroit Tigers and came back to play a spring training game against the Astros and hit 3 home runs in a single game. And Jeff Luhnow says he remembers, he's like, oh my God, what did we do? And it turned out what they had done was they had outright cut a guy who almost immediately became one of the top 5 hitters in baseball, which he remains today for the Red Sox. So a lot of other organizations would have, tucked in their tails after this, kind of not used it productively. But the Astros did. Essentially, one of the many things they decided was that when a guy comes in after a winter and says that he's made some positive changes, they're going to give him a chance to show them if that's real or not.
Our second lightning round. Question 1. True or false? You, Ben Reiter, deep down believe that you should have been considered for a World Series ring.
Absolutely false. I didn't do anything. It was the players who did it. No, I don't. It's a little gaudy from me as well, to be honest. I don't know if I'd wear it.
2, the 2021 World Series winner will be the blanks.
Well, on November 2nd, somebody said, dude, this is amazing. You got this famous prediction right. You have to never make a prediction again, right? The problem was that on November 1st, I'd written a column already in essay.com predicting that the Astros would also win the 2018 World Series. So I kind of messed that up already. 2021, however, the Astros are built to be in this thing for the long haul. A big part of all the pain they went through for so many losing seasons was that of sustainability, that they are now set up to perpetuate their success going forward. but there are a few other teams who are also set up that way. So I guess earmuff SIG, I think 2021, it might be the Yankees.
As a pall settles over the room at that prospect. Let's take a couple of questions from the crowd.
Yes.
So I have a question kind of about organizational alignment. So you talked about, like, I haven't read the book obviously, but you talked about player chemistry and chemistry in the locker room. But I think what's often mentioned in sports, particularly after teams win championships, is how important organizational alignment is, starting from the ownership or down to the front office and down into the dugout. Could you touch on that and how kind of the Astros ensured that they would have that organizational alignment?
So the question is, how did the Astros ensure they had organizational alignment all the way down their minor league system, so everybody was kind of trying to do the same thing, was on the same page at all time? There are many ways they did this. This is a key one. One of the ways they've done it recently is they sent Sig Mejdal, who is, who was their head data man, is now a special assistant for process improvement. He's an analyst, really. They sent him to their lowest minor league level last summer in Troy, New York, to kind of see and observe and make recommendations as to how their processes were being implemented there and then carried all the way through. Now this season, I understand that SIG is traveling to each minor league affiliate to ensure the same thing and to really integrate this analytical mindset with their traditional teachings. It's certainly a big part of what the Astros do. It's something the Cardinals have done for a long time, and of course a lot of the Astros executives came from St. Louis. So yeah, certainly you want all the players learning the same thing. And at this point, honestly, if they kind of chafe against some of the teachings, they're trying to give them, the rings do a lot of the talking. I think that process has gotten a lot easier. Yes, in the glasses.
I'm a sports journalist from Brazil,
hi.
coming from Russia, where Croatia faced France in the finals of the World Cup, and nobody could have ever predicted that. Is the Astroball model good only for baseball, which is so based in the statistics, or can you predict the next World Cup champion?
Well, no, I can't. But no, I mean, look, soccer is an area in which there's a lot of statistical advancement being made, a lot of advancement in analytics. In some ways, it's an area in which, you can have a bit more of an advantage by using it properly. Every major league team at this point has a data department. That's not necessarily true, especially at all levels of international football. So yeah, I mean, in some ways, at least some levels of international football are like baseball was 10 years ago or more. So certainly it can be successfully applied there, even though a sport like soccer is more difficult to track than baseball, which is based on, one-on-one matchups and things like that. Craig, yeah.
One of the chapters you touched on the Astros' extreme defensive shifts.
Yeah.
And how they kind of, pioneered it, but employed it quite a bit. To what extent do you see teams doing that from an offensive standpoint, or why don't teams do that from an offensive standpoint in terms of when there's a shift, hitting against the shift?
That's been a question that we've asked that, it's been kind of raging ever since teams like the Astros started shifting so much about 4 or 5 years ago. It's complicated. Part of it is that players are paid to hit for power, and it's hard to tell a slugger, you're going to bunt the next 10 times down the third base line. Although maybe if you did, teams would shift, stop employing the shift so much. But really, that's one of those things that I think is more of a cultural thing. I think if you looked at it from a strictly analytical standpoint, that's certainly what they should probably do.
All right,
How about one more? Danny.
Who is your favorite player in the story and why?
Well, even though Dallas Keuchel broke his promise, apparently, as far as my Rays, he's a very intelligent, analytical person, and he also posted about the book on Instagram the other day. So, probably him.
All right, so now it's worked, and success begets imitation. We have 31 other teams that are probably exploring what they can learn from the Astros' success. And a handful of them probably should consider a teardown of some sort. But this gets to the point of like, if we know this kind of works, we all know that if 15 teams do it at once, or 10 teams do it once, or 6 do it at once, they all can't be successful at it. And it can be a teardown that doesn't have the same happy ending that the Astros did. I mean, the Astros took great risks here. I mean, let's go back to pre-2014. I mean, this is still a number that staggers me. From time to time, they would have a local TV rating of 0.0, which means that like fewer people were watching an Astros game at any time than are in this room right now, which I find really hard to believe. You know, can the game afford, you know, a bunch of multiple teams losing 100 games, seeing attendance and ratings decline?
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the characters in the book says that back when they started this plan, they were kind of alone at the buffet. And now, if you look around the league, there's 6 or 7 or 8 teams who are kind of trying to do the same thing. And you're right, it's not going to work out for most of them, actually. At least some of them are sentencing themselves to a decade of being terrible, right? And then they're going to have to start again. So it's a great risk, and it's a risk to the competitiveness of the league as well. But look, I think there's a natural cycle to this thing. I think what we saw this year is that certain teams who maybe planned to build for one more year got a sense of that landscape and started going for it. If you look at the Phillies in particular, signing Jake Arrieta, it's probably a year ahead of their plan, from what I understand. But, you know, you look around the league and a third of the league isn't even trying to win and you're on the cusp, maybe it is your time. So I think that, you know, it's a matter of natural cycles. But right now, it certainly is a problem that there seems to be a few super teams and then so many teams that are just non-competitive.
What are the teams that you would identify as trying to emulate that model to some degree, that we can cite as pursuing the teardown model or something derivative of that?
I mean, I think the Padres are a very advanced organization that's following a lot of what the Astros have done successfully. If you look at the White Sox, perhaps another one, although I think they're building their analytics capabilities. They certainly have the young talent. Those are two that I'd probably cite right off the bat.
Okay, maybe this isn't one size fits all, but you know, since we're in New York, I want to talk about 2 interesting cases. You know, we have the Yankees, who in 2015 were second place team, who momentarily found themselves in a sort of a crossroads of sorts. They had a lot of big contracts on the books, not necessarily most promising path going forward, and I wouldn't go so far as to say in a no man's land, but at a crossroads for sure, and somewhat brilliantly managed to rebuild quickly without any great pain. On the flip side of the coin, you have a team that went to a World Series in 2015 in this town, and I can just let that hang in the air for a second. Which direction should the Mets go? Is there an argument to be made for a teardown, even setting aside the unlikely nature of it, unlikeliness of it under the current ownership?
I don't think that most teams have to do what the Astros did, because when Jeff Luhnow arrived, the cupboard was empty at the major league level, but they also had just been ranked one of the worst minor league teams as well. So they had, from a valuation standpoint, they had essentially no assets of any value whatsoever. Whereas right now, at least, the Mets certainly do. You know, Jacob deGrom and Noah Syndergaard in particular. So yeah, I mean, I think if you were the Astros and you came in and you had deGrom and Syndergaard, you would probably at least have to strongly consider trading them now while you could get the best value back for them, as opposed to waiting a few more years as their value declines. I think the risk for the Mets is that they wait too long and then, you know, they don't have any assets at the major league level or the minor league level.
As far as this current Astros crew, I mean, last year it would be, you wouldn't be human if you didn't become like, I mean, we know you got emotionally attached to this story. How could you not? You know, and you'll always identify that 2017 people with the individuals who are in your book. But you know, even the Astros are going to have to move forward. You know, it's unlikely that in a year or two you might have the same nucleus here. But you know, a lot of the people who made last year so special and so entertaining. I feel like this is almost a question for Sig in a way, but you can be his proxy, I guess. Here is, you know, you teams do have to move on, and that's the nature of the sport. And you know, How hard is it for you to kind of, on a personal level, to picture an Astros team in 2019 without Dallas Keuchel? And that's not making any presumption about who might be staying or leaving after this season.
Right. I mean, it really is a book about process over outcome. And, you know, the Astros are prepared for that. You know, they're not pretending that time won't move on. They're not going to be caught like the Royals were a couple years ago with the entire core of a champion leaving all at once and leaving them with nothing. So I don't think I'm that emotionally attached to the players. I mean, I understand that they're going to be moving on, and if you look at the way the Astros have constructed their team, yes, Dallas Keuchel's a free agent after this year, but oh, look who they have in the minor leagues. It's the guy who most people believe is the best pitching prospect in baseball, Forrest Whitley, ready to step up. I mean, that's not in any way a mistake. That's not in any way a coincidence. That's how they have set this organization up. And if you project it out, players will be leaving year after year, but they'll be replaced.
Lightning round 3. I think you kind of answered this question, but this might be slightly different. Other than Sig, and I believe this to be true, I mean, he was clearly somebody you have a great deal of affection for. You know, who was your favorite subject to interview for the book? Was it Keuchel or was it somebody else? Was there somebody who was especially surprising to you that you got to know perhaps after the fact?
Yeah, I think probably Carlos Beltran was my favorite. He actually lives in New York City on, I think, 72nd and 2nd. He still lives up there. And, you know, I get there, and he seems a little down, I guess. And I was like, what's wrong, man? Like, retirement getting you down? And it turns out that his daughters go to Dalton School, and that he had just gotten the tuition bill. And he's like, man, private school is so expensive in New York. I was like, Carlos, I know for a fact you made $16 million last year. But beyond that, I just think really getting a chance to pick the brain of somebody like that was pretty rare opportunity. I think that's why it's so strongly reflected in the book.
You're already on the record at the end of last year saying that the Astros will win the 2018 World Series. Who will they defeat in the 2018 World Series?
I think we might be headed for a rematch, honestly. I mean, the Dodgers had about as bad a first 2 months as a team of that talent could have. They've righted the ship. They've added Manny Machado. Could be round 2, which would not be a bad thing because last year's was pretty good.
Jay Jaffe approves. He's looking forward to writing Dodger Ball, scheduled for the summer of 2019. Let's take a few more questions from the crowd.
Yes.
Hey, Ewan, thanks a lot, Ben, for writing the book. I had a question about, I listened to your interview on Fan a couple weeks ago, and you mentioned not to underestimate the hiring of A.J. Hinch. And I think back to the scene from Moneyball where we have Dean and are now arguing about Carlos Pena. What has been the relationship between A.J. Hinch and Jeff Luhnow? I'm sure it's been pretty good, but can you share an anecdote or share some insight on how those two gentlemen have made this very successful organization?
Right. Well, A.J. Hinch is the second manager that Jeff Luhnow's had with the Astros. The first one was Bo Porter, who's, you know, good baseball man, well respected, but, you know, he was one of the people who did not give J.D. Martinez enough at bats during that spring training to show what he'd become. So that was the reason why he's no longer the manager of the Astros. In some ways, Hinch is like the center of the organization. He's, you know, the pipe between the front office and the dugout. He's the center of the feedback loop. So I thought what was interesting was, you know, Luhnow interviewed 10 people to become the manager a couple of years ago, and he asked them all the same question, which was, I'm going to send down the lineup to the dugout every day. Like, are you okay with that? And a lot of the managers said, yes, you know, it's a data-driven organization, that's fine. Hinch was one of them that said no, right? That was the answer that Luhnow was looking for, because the role of the manager is to know what the numbers aren't showing, who's sick, who's had a fight with his girlfriend, whose elbow hurts. Like, that's the manager's job, to mesh the numbers with the reality on the ground. He might have to explain upstairs later why he made those decisions, but he's certainly empowered in the Astros organization to make those calls. So that's one reason why Hinch has been so important. Charlotte.
Talk a little bit about how this might or might not be applicable to soccer, but all different kinds of organizations, of course, are trying to figure out how to use data intelligently as well as combining with qualitative factors. So do you think that there are lessons that are applicable to certain industries or certain types of companies, or is that a little bit of a spectrum?
I think that there are certainly lessons. I think that a lot of organizations fall into the trap of believing that big data is the be-all and end-all as a decision maker, and that's that. Whereas, countless examples from the past decade or more have shown that data is fallible and that a human needs to be in charge and to, triage really the data that he's getting. For example, in the criminal justice world, there's a lot of data that police departments have to use to tell them where to deploy officers and things like that. But that data is already skewed based on practices they've already been doing, such as putting way more officers in inner cities. And if you have more officers there, they're likely to make more arrests. And then it becomes a loop where you believe that because you're making more arrests in the inner cities, you have to send more officers there, and it kind of leads to the over-policing and over-arrests in certain part of the country. And of course, we had a presidential candidate a couple years ago who campaign said that, she had the greatest data operation in the history of politics. And one of the things that analysis said was she did not need to even visit states like Michigan or Wisconsin because her chances of winning them was so certain. It seems like that certainly was a conclusion that a smart human might have questioned. So I think that these concepts might apply to all sorts of fields beyond sports.
Yeah, you mentioned how the front office was able to incorporate not only the data people, but also the people with maybe a more old school mindset, like Nolan Ryan. I know that you said Uno was a little unsuccessful in St. Louis in getting those people to buy into his philosophy. So how did he get them on board in Houston, and what did he take from them that he added to his more data-driven mindset?
Well, first, he was the boss in Houston, so even Nolan Ryan kind of had to respect what he was saying. Second, look, he ran the scouting department in St. Louis, and his techniques worked. If you look back at the drafts that he ran, they produced the most major leaguers of any teams over the period that he was scouting director. So he had already had that track record once he got to Houston. So I think that those two things really helped contribute to to people believing in him. And of course, if they didn't believe him, he could just fire them. So that was helpful too.
All right. The last question I have for you is the Astros, received the ultimate imprimatur of success. They won the World Series, but what if they lose Game 7 to the Dodgers? I know we don't want to think about that. What if they don't get past the ALCS? They were down 3-2 to Yankees going home, and they played elimination games in both those series. But there's still a great, in my mind, argument that this book still should have been written. Was it that reliant on that thin a thread that, winning the World Series was the reason you wrote this book? Would you have written this book if either of those other two scenarios had played out?
I like to think so, but that is kind of one of the ironies. This is a book about putting process above outcome, but in some ways, at least, its success was dependent on this outcome. Sig calls the World Series a coin toss competition, essentially, right? Like, baseball is designed to be played over long stretches of time, and these short series, any team could beat any team really in a 7-game series. But, I guess I'm lucky that the coin came up heads.
Yeah, Billy Beane, he called it a crapshoot, I believe.
Right.
And they never won a World Series, and yet the book got written, and it sold many copies. And I suspect this will sell many copies too. One thing I've religiously been following your Twitter account over the last 3 weeks, and it's almost like the approval. It's like Russian election level of adulation for you. But anyways, it's a great accomplishment, and if you haven't read it yet, I'm envious of you. I've actually read it twice now, and you really have something to look forward to. And our congratulations and our thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.